We like to think of our purchasing decisions as carefully calibrated equations. We weigh the price, evaluate the quality, and logically calculate the best possible outcome. But in reality, an entire matrix of perfectly balanced benefits can be instantly derailed by a single unacceptable flaw. Human preference is not a static database of ranked desires waiting to be accessed. It is a real-time construct, built on the fly and heavily influenced by the immediate environment in which the choice is presented. To understand how this construction works, we have to look at the cognitive toggle switch known as MAO: motivation, ability, and opportunity. The state of these three factors determines exactly which operating system the brain will deploy to make a decision. When MAO is high, we use compensatory models, engaging in effortful trade-offs where a strength can make up for a weakness. When MAO is low, we default to non-compensatory models, rapid, ruthless logic gates where a single failure eliminates an option entirely. Determining whether a consumer calculates a trade-off or applies a ruthless cutoff dictates every marketing tactic. Strategic success depends on identifying which of these two algorithms is currently in control. Every decision begins with problem recognition, the moment a consumer perceives a gap between their actual state and their ideal state. This discrepancy immediately triggers an internal search, forcing the brain to scan memory for potential solutions. Looking at this visual funnel, we see how memory is highly selective. Out of the thousands of products in a given category, consumers typically recall a tiny subset of just 2 to 8 options. This surviving group is known as the consideration or evoked set, and it is the only group that actually makes it to the evaluation stage. Severe cognitive limits restrict what passes through this funnel. One major barrier is inhibition. Recalling one highly specific attribute of a product actively suppresses the recall of competing attributes, narrowing the consumer's focus to a highly restricted set of data points. To survive this mental filter, a piece of information must possess attribute determinants. This means the trait must be both salient, prominent enough to be noticed, and diagnostic, meaning it is actively useful for distinguishing one object from another. As noted in this text, 3 specific memory biases warp this internal search: confirmation bias, inhibition, and mood-congruent recall. These factors actively distort what information enters the consideration set. If your product fails to survive this biased pre-evaluative memory filter, the quality of your engineering does not matter. A consumer cannot choose an option they never recalled in the first place. If a consumer has the motivation and cognitive resources, they will evaluate their evoked set using compensatory rules. This is the hallmark of rational, highly structured processing. Looking at this matrix, we can see the multi-attribute model in action. Here, the consumer evaluates options entirely by brand, sequentially scoring each one across multiple weighted criteria. Every attribute score is multiplied by an importance weight. Those individual values are then summed up to calculate a total overall score for that specific brand. The defining characteristic of this system is compensation. A severe weakness in one area, like a high price, can be completely offset by an immense strength in another, like premium build quality, allowing the final score to remain competitive. The structural problem with this process is that it demands massive cognitive effort. Because of the heavy mental load required to perform these calculations, consumers rarely use this model for daily decisions. They rely on shortcuts instead. When time or motivation is low, consumers switch to non-compensatory models. These operate as strict logic gates. A single failure eliminates an option entirely, and trade-offs are mathematically impossible. In this matrix, we see the lexicographic strategy. The consumer isolates the single most important attribute. The brand with the highest score in that specific category wins instantly, and all other data points are completely ignored. A slightly more complex version is elimination by aspects. Here, the consumer sets a minimum cutoff for the top attribute, eliminating anything that falls short. They then move to the second most important attribute and repeat the process until only one option remains. Notice that both the lexicographic and elimination by aspects models process data entirely by attribute. They scan horizontally across the market, rather than evaluating one entire brand at a time. Conversely, the conjunctive model evaluates by brand. The consumer sets a minimum acceptable level for every single attribute. If a product fails even one of these mandatory minimums, it is immediately rejected. The disjunctive model takes the opposite approach. The consumer sets an exceptionally high standard on just one or two key attributes. A brand survives solely by spiking past this threshold, even if its average performance everywhere else is mediocre. This text clearly defines these four exact models: lexicographic, elimination by aspects, conjunctive, and disjunctive, as the primary shortcuts used to bypass the mental exhaustion of full calculation. In a non-compensatory environment, the rules of competition change. Your goal is no longer to offer the best overall product. Your goal is simply to ensure you never fail the consumer's primary cutoff metric. By ignoring the vast majority of product data to focus on a single attribute or cutoff, non-compensatory models create a narrow cognitive focus. This simplification makes the decision context-dependent, meaning that small changes in how options are presented often dictate the choice itself. Consider the availability heuristic. Consumers judge the likelihood or favorability of an outcome purely based on how easily examples come to mind. The speed of recall completely overrides actual statistical evidence. This split screen illustrates variety seeking. When making simultaneous choices for future consumption, consumers actively select more variety than they do when making sequential daily choices. The abstraction of future events drives a need for perceived diversity. Then there is the endowment effect. Once a consumer owns something, their reference point shifts. Giving it up feels like a loss, and the psychological weight of a loss registers far heavier than the equivalent value of a gain. These heuristics prove a critical reality. Preferences are not stable data points extracted from memory. They are fluid responses, actively sculpted by the immediate environment of the decision itself. As this summary shows, every decision model we've examined falls across two primary dimensions: whether the processing happens by brand versus by attribute, and whether the underlying math is compensatory or non-compensatory. But the ultimate complexity lies in how these systems interact. Consumers rarely rely on a single model from start to finish. Instead, they deploy them in sequential phases. In this two-stage visualization, a consumer uses a low-effort, non-compensatory strategy, like the conjunctive model, to aggressively filter 50 options down to 3. Only then do they switch to a high-effort, compensatory model to carefully weigh the final survivors on a delicate balancing scale. This predictable cognitive sequencing is exactly what marketers target through choice architecture. It is the deliberate design of the presentation environment to interface with and influence these exact mental algorithms. Marketers who master these cognitive bottlenecks engineer the decision environment to shape the very preferences they seek to serve. Understanding the algorithm is the only way to successfully design the choice.